We began looking yesterday at comparisons between the North and the South as they begin war, as to who had advantages, with whom are the disadvantages. Yesterday, we looked at the population and said overwhelmingly who had the advantage. North. We looked at the railroads, before that, agriculture, and who grew more food crops. North. We looked at railroads, who had the most railroads. The North, including manufacturing of locomotives. Now we're going to look at manufacturing. In manufacturing, and by manufacturing establishments, we're talking about factories essentially. The North has 110,000 factories, the South 18,000. So the North had 5 times as many factories as the South did. Now you might say, but maybe there are a bunch of little factories and the South has big factories. No, because when you look at the number of industrial workers, you see the North had 1.5 million factory workers and the South had 110,000. So the North not only has more factories, but they're bigger. They have a lot more people working in them, over 10 times the amount of people working in the northern factories as in the southern factories. We look at the value of firearms. That's a part of manufacturing, something that's important. If you're going to war, you got to have firearms, right? The value in the North was $2.25 million worth of firearms manufactured in 1860. In the South, only $73,000 worth of firearms manufactured. So the North has manufactured over 30 times the amount of firearms as the South. So you've got a lot more people, you've got more firearms. All that put together indicates that you probably have a distinct advantage if you're in the North. If you're looking at who's going to win this war, looking at all the facts, you say there's no way the South can win. Here's a graph that kind of points it out in a different way. Might help you to visualize it. Here are the number of workers in the North compared with the South. The number of factories compared with the North and the South. Here's the value of goods produced, North and South. Railroad tracks, North and South. Textiles, including cotton cloth and woolen goods. The North, 17-to-1 ratio over the South. It's because why? Well, they're producing cotton, but they're not producing cotton cloth. So they're sending the cotton to New England or to England to be made into cloth. Firearms, 32-to-1 ratio. Pig iron. So you're making anything metal, you're making out of pig iron, and you can see the ratio there as well. Now there's one last area that we need to mention when we're looking at advantages of one side or the other, and that is the area of military leadership. And if you've been hoping that at least there would be some advantage to the South somewhere to make this somewhat of an interesting war, this is the area. Military leadership. There was a strong military tradition in the South that contributed to many Southerners attending West Point, the military academy in New York, as well as other military academies in the South. So Southern men grew up with an expectation that they would get military training. And of course that wasn't true in the North. In the South it was common. And so as a result, many of the Confederate officers were better trained than their Union counterparts. And so when you look at the military leadership of the South, you have to give that advantage to the South, military leadership. It sort of reminds us a little bit of the War of Independence. the colonists didn't have very many advantages at all. The British had almost all the advantages, but when it came down to the leadership, it turned out that Washington was a better leader than the different generals that were leading the British. All right, so conclusion. The Union had a distinct advantage from military conflict. This is not to say, again, whoops, I forgot to put that up there for you. Okay, so there's what I just said. The Union had a distinct advantage from military conflict. That's not to say that the Confederacy was economically disadvantaged. They weren't in poverty. As an independent nation, the economy of the Confederate States was the third largest on the American and European continents. Its purchase of advanced farm implements was 25% higher than the North. And its per capita income was 10% higher than all states west of New York and Pennsylvania. So the Confederate States were economically prosperous. They just didn't have a lot of the things that you need if you're going to fight a war. That advantage went to them, to the North. So rating the North and South. Now, once again, we look at total population. Here's another area: bank deposits, factories, cotton. Well, there the South has 99.9% of the cotton grown. Must be a few patches of ground in Maryland that have some cotton in it. Who knows? Food crops, horses. That's another part that we didn't talk about. For war. Donkeys and mules. The South has an advantage there. Donkeys and mules. That's helpful. Railroad tracks, you can see. So this is how the United States looked before secession. And this is how it looks as states begin to secede. So the way it turns out, we have the Union states, of course, in red. The slaves that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter are down here, the lower South. After Fort Sumter, when Lincoln called out all those troops to march against the South, these states joined. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland may have joined if they had been allowed to, but as I told you, Lincoln sent troops to prevent their legislature from meeting to do that. And so these are border slave states that did not secede. Delaware would be included in that as well. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Now, there's a lot of controversy today over the flag that hangs behind me. It has been a part of different capitals of southern states flying this flag. It's actually a part of some state flags as well. But it's important for us to understand truth, not people's perceptions of truth. The question is, who gets to define the meaning of any symbol? Those who designed the symbol, or those who have decided to misuse or to oppose the symbol? Who gets to decide what a symbol means? And by the way, although most people call this the flag of the Confederacy, it's not. Everybody know what this is? Joey?
Isn't it a war flag?
Yeah, it's a battle flag.
That's right.
This was never the flag of the Confederacy. It's simply a battle flag. You know, they had different flags they carried into battle. This is one of them. So who gets to define what that means? Well, just because evil groups have expropriated this flag does not legitimize their usage. Just like people have taken the cross and have done evil things with a symbol of the cross. You think of the Ku Klux Klan, who burned crosses outside of black people's homes in order to intimidate them. Does that mean the cross itself is an evil symbol? No, just because evil people use it doesn't mean it's evil. And just because evil people might use the Confederate battle flag doesn't mean the flag itself is evil. Opponents' caricatures cannot define a symbol. And if you know a little of the history behind the flag, you may have a greater understanding of it. The flag itself, with the bars across like that, is a descendant of the Scottish St. Andrew's Cross, a flag that identified the Scots as a Christian people. So when the Scottish people became a Christian nation, this is the flag they adopted. It's called St. Andrew's Cross because there's a legend that Andrew, one of the apostles, was crucified on a cross that was this way instead of straight up and down. As such, the flag was intended to be a banner signifying the Christian heritage of the southern people. So, why are these on there? Because that was part of their Christian heritage. The designer of the flag, and if you want to know what something means, you ask who designed it, right? Here's what he said. The flag should be a token of humble acknowledgement of God and be a public testimony to the world that our trust is in the Lord our God. Now, to Southern soldiers and their families, the Confederate battle flag symbolized their Christian heritage and resistance to tyranny. So the red field represents the blood of Christ. The white border represents the protection of God. The blue X represents the Christian cross of St. Andrew, the first disciple of Jesus Christ and the patron saint of Scotland. The 13 stars represent the 13 southern states. And so the message of the Confederate battle flag is, through the blood of Christ, with the protection of God, we, the 13 states, are united in our Christian fight for liberty. And because people, evil people, have taken this and chosen to use this to represent their racism, doesn't change the original intent or design of the flag itself. Any comments? Questions? This is a painting of Robert E. Lee outside of the home in which he lived in Virginia. Does anybody know the name of that home, that house, or where it's located?
It's at the one graveyard in DC, right?
It's at the graveyard called Arlington National Cemetery. It's the name of it is the Custis Lee Mansion. The Lee, Robert E. Lee, Custis comes from the woman's family who Lee married, and that was George Washington Custis. Wash in the presentation we saw George Washington. So Robert E. Lee married the granddaughter, or step-granddaughter, if you want to be specific, of George Washington. And they lived there, just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. How many of you have been to Arlington National Cemetery? Okay. How many have been to the Custis Lee Mansion? Okay, it's a pretty neat place, pretty impressive. He never lived there again after the war. And I might tell you this again, so forgive me if I repeat it, but maybe you'll remember it more if I say it twice. The reason that Arlington National Cemetery was set up was because a Union general was using that as his headquarters during the war, and he's the one that designated the land around the mansion to be used as a cemetery because he said he wanted Lee, after the war, to be able to sit on his porch and see all of the men that were killed because of him. Turned his lawn into a graveyard. But Lee never went back. Lee was, as I told you before, anti-slavery and anti-secession. But he had this to say, which I think is provocative. He said, a union that can only be maintained by swords and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war are to take the place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me. And as the war begins, you know that Lee was requested by Lincoln to be the commander of the Union Army. And he refused, not because he was for slavery, not because he was for secession. He refused because he could not see himself fighting against his homeland of Virginia. And so he refused the offer and ended up becoming a general in the Confederate Army. Stephen?
And today, don't most Americans view him as like an evil person?
Well, I don't know about most people. I know that I was in a meeting, a small group meeting of some men at my church, and I'm not sure how it came up, but one of the men made the comment that Robert E. Lee was a traitor to his country. And I didn't want to get into it with him. But that may be the perspective. And if you look around at college campuses, or you look at different state houses in the southern states where there are statues of Robert E. Lee, or where things are named after Lee, there's a movement to get rid of all those because he was a Southern general. And they don't care to look into the character of the man or what he believed. They're blinded by their hatred of anything that is essentially constitutional and conservative. Lee was willing to go by the Constitution. As you've seen, Lincoln was not. So since Lee turned down the offer to lead the Union Army, Lincoln turned to, first of all, an old war horse, Winfield Scott. Remember, he had led forces during the Mexican War, but he was actually too old and fat to get into the saddle, and so he decided it was time to retire. And so Lincoln had to turn to others. But let's talk about strategy. When you're going to fight a war, you've got to have some strategy, right? The South has no advantages except maybe leadership. So what's your strategy going to be? What would you think if you're a Southern leader? What would you propose you should do in order to win this war? What do you think? Or would you just pack it in and say, okay, again, we give up, we're going to try. Everything's against us. What do you think, Michaela? Wait for the right moment? To do what? Okay, so look for a weakness to attack the North. Think back to the American colonies. What was the strategy of the American colonies concerning fighting against the British? What was the overall strategy they pursued? What did the colonies, the 13 colonies, have to do in order to accomplish independence from Great Britain? What did they have to do?
You had to at least tie in the war.
Yeah, did they have to win the war? No, they just had to fight long enough for the British to get tired of fighting and to decide to quit. So it had to come out to no more than a tie, really, in order for the colonists to win. The same thing is true of the South. There's a lot of parallels between what the South is fighting for and the strategy. So let's look at some of that. First of all, if you're in the North, you have to go on the offensive by invading the South. Because what if the North doesn't invade the South? Will there be a war? No. Because the South doesn't want to fight a war. They just want to be left alone. If you want to be left alone, you don't go attacking somebody. You stay away. And so the North had to invade and defeat the Southern armies in the field. They had to invade and defeat in order to win. So like the British, they had to actually win the war in order to win the war. To be on the winning side, they had to actually defeat the enemy. Now, what was the Southern strategy? Play defense. Just outlast the North's will to fight. Just keep fighting long enough that the Northerners will say, I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. So the South didn't have to win. They just had to not lose. You follow? Now, because the North was not successful in the early going, the Southern leadership did a good job of defeating the Northern Army over and over again. By mid-1862, the Northern strategy included the concept of total war. Have you ever heard that term before, total war? Any idea what you think, what that might mean? I mean, what's regular war and then total war? Well, as you're thinking about it, I will give you some information here. Most Christian nations, from at least the Middle Ages on, followed the concept of a just war doctrine. In other words, when you're fighting, you fight in a just manner. You don't go after civilians. You fight other soldiers. There's certain rules to warfare, in other words, that have been followed for centuries, that were developed principally by Christians. It's the idea that you're fighting for a just cause, and you're protecting the lives, properties, and freedoms of the citizens of the enemy nation. So you don't try to kill the enemy's children and families. General William T. Tecumseh Sherman summed up the application of the total war philosophy. He said, "This war differs from other wars in this particular. We are not fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." So he says, we've got to go after the whole society, not just the soldiers. Later, he would write to Secretary of War Stanton that there is a class of people, men, women, and children, who must be killed or banished before you can hope for peace and order. So he's not talking about killing soldiers. He said there are men, women, and children that you've got to kill or banish before you can have victory. This policy would include the mass execution of prisoners of war and civilians, and complete destruction of all property. This strategy included the unnecessary sacrifice of Union soldiers who were captured. There were times when, because the Southerners knew they could not feed all the Union soldiers they had captured, they offered to let them go back. Just let them come back, or make arrangements with the Union Army, pick up your soldiers. And they refused. They refused to take their soldiers back. Why? They saw that as part of the plan to make the South take care of these prisoners of war, and that would drain resources from the Southern armies, which meant the death of many of those Union soldiers, because the South didn't have the means to continue to take care of them. It meant the retributive treatment of Confederate prisoners of war. So in other words, treat the prisoners of war badly on purpose. Secretary of War Stanton refused to either allow supplies to be sent to Union prisoners at Andersonville, the Southern camp, or to accepting the release of prisoners from that facility, even sending prisoners back. Christian churches were prohibited by federal authorities in Washington from trying to relieve the sufferings of prisoners detained at Camp Douglas in Chicago. So, get this perspective. This idea of total war, it's at any cost. Sending our own prisoners, people of our own army, back as prisoners of war, and then when they had prisoners of war, Confederate soldiers, refusing to allow churches to even come in and to help out by giving them some of the necessities that they might have. That's total war. You see it exemplified, especially as Sherman marches towards the end of the war through Georgia and destroys everything in sight. That was the Union's perspective as of 1862. We'll get to that, and we'll look at the initial fighting, some of the battles that take place beginning tomorrow. For tomorrow, I want you to read pages 284 to 290. Just read that, give you some other information about what we're doing. If you have colored pencils, bring them tomorrow. We're going to use them on the map that you have in the materials I've given you. And I'll hopefully we'll get some time for you to work on that tomorrow. All right, any questions? So read page 284 to 290. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot, I didn't say, do the questions on page 290 also. Do the questions on page 290, incomplete sentences. And then also bring color pencils to use tomorrow, if you can. Or something colored. Some of you might have some markers, as long as they're not too inky, so that it soaks into the paper and destroys it. Color pencils would be the best. Any questions?
Okay, listen, really, I'm